The poker chips clinked like funeral bells in the smoky back room of Murphy's saloon, each sound driving another nail into Sarah Beth Coleman's coffin. She pressed her ear against the rough wooden door, her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened to her husband's voice crack with desperation. "I'm good for it, Jameson. Just give me one more hand, one more chance to win it all back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The autumn wind of 1887 rattled the windows of the Colorado mining town, but inside that back room, the air hung thick with cigar smoke, whiskey fumes, and the stench of broken dreams. Sarah Beth had followed Thomas here after 3 days of him not coming home. 3 days of her surviving on nothing but stale bread and the gnawing fear that something terrible was about to happen. Now she knew she'd been right. "Thomas Coleman, you've been saying that same line for 6 months now," came the gravelly voice of Marcus Jameson, the most feared man in Silver Ridge. "You owe me $800. That's more money than most folks in this town see in 5 years. Sarah Beth's knees nearly buckled. $800. Their entire homestead wasn't worth half that amount. The small cabin Thomas had inherited from his father, the 20 acres of stubborn mountain soil, the 3 chickens, an old milk cow, all of it together might fetch $300 if they were lucky. I know. Thomas's voice grew more frantic. "But I've got a sure thing. My contact in Denver says there's a silver vein running right through Peterson's property. If I can just stake a claim, with what money?" Jameson's laugh was like gravel scraping against bone. "You don't have a pot to piss in, Coleman. Haven't had one since you started playing at my tables." Through the crack in the door, Sarah Beth could see her husband's profile in the amber lamplight. Once Thomas Coleman had been the handsomest man in 3 counties. Tall and lean, with thick brown hair and eyes like summer sky, he'd swept her off her feet when she was barely 17. That was 8 years ago, before the gambling fever took hold of him like a sickness, before those sky-blue eyes turned hollow and desperate, before his hands started shaking every morning until he could get to the cards or dice. "Please, Marcus, I'm begging you. My wife, she doesn't know how bad things have gotten. If I could just—" "Your wife." Jameson's voice turned thoughtful, almost amused. "Now there's an interesting topic." Sarah Beth felt ice water flood her veins. She pressed closer to the door, her breath coming in short, silent gasps. "Sarah Beth Coleman," Jameson continued, and she could hear him standing up, boots creaking against floorboards. "I've seen her around town. Pretty little thing. Real pretty. Got that delicate look about her like a china doll. Bet she'd clean up real nice." "Marcus, don't." Thomas's voice held a warning, but it was weak, pathetic. Like a lamb trying to growl at a wolf. "Don't what, Coleman? Don't notice that your wife is about the finest-looking woman in this entire territory? Don't wonder what a beauty like that is doing married to a worthless gambling fool like you?" The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Sarah Beth found herself holding her breath, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms. "I have a proposition for you." "Thomas, I'm listening." Those 2 words hit Sarah Beth like physical blows. He was listening. Not telling Jameson to go to hell, not walking out, not defending her honor, just listening. "I've got business interests in Denver. High-class establishments that cater to gentlemen with refined tastes and deep pockets. A woman like your Sarah Beth, with the right clothes, the right training. She could earn back your debt in a few months, maybe less, if she's as sweet as she looks." The world tilted sideways. Sarah Beth grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling, her stomach churning with bile and disbelief. Jameson was talking about selling her. Actually selling her like she was livestock or property, and Thomas hadn't said no. I don't know, Marcus. She's my wife. She's your wife who's about to be homeless when I foreclose on your property next week," Jameson said coldly. "She's your wife who's going to watch the sheriff drag you off to debtor's prison. She's your wife who'll be left with nothing but the clothes on her back and no way to survive in this world." Another long pause. Sarah Beth could hear Thomas breathing heavily, could almost see him running those shaking hands through his hair, the way he did when the gambling fever was riding him hard. "How long?" Thomas finally asked, and Sarah Beth's heart shattered into a million pieces. 6 months. Maybe a year, depending on how popular she proves to be. Think of it as an investment, Coleman. She works off your debt, comes back to you clean-slated. You could start over, maybe move somewhere new, where nobody knows about your difficulties. And if I say no? Jameson's laugh was like winter wind through a graveyard. Then tomorrow morning my men start seizing your property. By tomorrow night, you're in a jail cell, and your pretty little wife is out on the street with nothing. How long you think a delicate thing like her would last on her own? Week, maybe 2, before someone with less refined intentions than mine takes an interest. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah Beth pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Thomas wouldn't actually consider this. He couldn't. But even as she thought it, she knew better. She'd watched the gambling sickness eat away at her husband like acid. Watched it devour every principle, every trace of the good man she'd married. He'd already sold her grandmother's wedding ring, the silver locket her mother had given her, even her Sunday dress, all fed into the insatiable maw of his addiction. Why should she be any different? "I need time to think," Thomas said, but his voice had already given up. "Already surrendered. You have until dawn," Jameson replied. "My men will be at your cabin at first light. Either you hand her over willing, or I take what's owed to me in property and see you in prison." "Your choice, Coleman." Sarah Beth heard chairs scraping, boots moving. They were getting ready to leave. Panic shot through her like lightning, and she turned and ran, her wool skirts tangling around her legs as she fled through the saloon's back entrance into the cold mountain night. The October air bit through her thin shawl, but she barely felt it. Her mind reeled with the impossibility of what she'd just heard. In a few hours, when Thomas came home, he would tell her that he'd sold her to pay his gambling debts. He would hand her over to Marcus Jameson like she was a poker chip, a commodity to be traded. She ran through the streets of Silver Ridge, past the general store where she'd bought penny candy as a child, past the church where she'd married Thomas 8 years ago, past all the familiar places that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Where could she go? Her parents were dead, killed in a wagon accident 3 years back. Her only sister had moved to California with her husband, and Sarah Beth had no money for train fare, even if she could figure out how to contact her. The cabin she shared with Thomas sat dark and cold at the edge of town, surrounded by the thin stands of aspen that gave the mountainside its golden autumn coat. She'd always loved this little house, had spent years making it into a home with careful needlework and flower gardens. Now it looked like a trap, a cage waiting to close around her. Inside, she lit a single lamp and sank into her mother's old rocking chair, the one piece of furniture Thomas hadn't been able to sell because she'd hidden it at a neighbor's house. The chair creaked softly as she rocked, the familiar sound a small comfort in a world that had just turned completely upside down. What were her options? She could run, try to make it to the next town before dawn, but she had no money, no horse, no supplies. She could throw herself on the mercy of the townspeople, but most of them knew about Thomas's gambling. They'd either turn her away to avoid trouble with Jameson, or worse, they'd expect her to pay for her husband's debts in ways she couldn't bear to think about. She could stay and fight, but what could one woman do against Marcus Jameson and his men? Jameson owned half the businesses in Silver Ridge, had the sheriff in his pocket, and commanded the loyalty of the roughest men in the territory through a combination of money and fear. As the hours crawled by, Sarah Beth found herself thinking about her wedding day. Thomas had been so different then, full of dreams about their future together. He was going to be a rancher, he'd said, or maybe go into business in Denver. They'd have children, a real home, maybe even one of those fine houses in the city with indoor plumbing and electric lights. Instead, she was sitting alone in a cold cabin, waiting for her husband to come home and tell her he'd sold her to a criminal. The front door creaked open just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hint of dawn. Thomas stepped inside, and Sarah Beth could smell the whiskey and defeat on him from across the room. He looked at her sitting in the rocking chair, still wearing the same blue dress she'd put on yesterday morning when the world had made sense. And his face crumpled. Sarah Beth. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." She stood up slowly, her body stiff from sitting in the chair all night. "I heard you, Thomas. I was at Murphy's. I heard every word." He staggered, grabbing the doorframe for support. You know? "I know that you've gambled away everything we own. I know that you owe Marcus Jameson $800. And I know that you've agreed to let him take me to Denver to work in one of his establishments." The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Thomas tried to meet her eyes, failed, and stared at the floor instead. "I didn't have a choice," he said finally. "If I don't give you to him, he'll take everything anyway and have me thrown in prison. At least this way. At least this way." "What, Thomas?" Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "At least this way you get to stay out of jail while your wife becomes a prostitute to pay for your gambling debts." He flinched as though she'd slapped him. "It's only temporary. Jameson said 6 months, maybe a year. When I come back." Sarah Beth laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter pain. "Thomas, do you understand what you're agreeing to? Do you understand what kind of life you're condemning me to? It won't be forever," he said desperately. "We can start over. Move somewhere new. I'll quit gambling, I swear it. I'll never touch another card or dice as long as I live." She stared at him, this man she'd loved since she was 17, and saw a stranger. The Thomas she'd married would have died before letting another man touch her. The Thomas she'd married would have put a bullet in Marcus Jameson's head before agreeing to this arrangement. But that man was gone, consumed by the fever that had turned him into a hollow shell of need and weakness. "They'll be here soon," Thomas said, unable to look at her. "Jameson's men, you should pack some things." Outside, the sound of horses and wheels on dirt announced the arrival of her new owners. Sarah Beth looked around the cabin one last time. At the sampler she'd embroidered that read, "Home, Sweet Home," at the kitchen table where she and Thomas had shared so many meals, at the bed where she dreamed of raising children. Then she walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold morning air to meet her fate. Marcus Jameson sat in an elegant black carriage, dressed in a fine suit with a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. He smiled when he saw her, the expression of a man who just acquired something valuable. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Ready for your new adventure?" Sarah Beth lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I suppose I am, Mr. Jameson." But as the carriage began to roll away from everything she'd ever known, Sarah Beth pressed her face to the window and whispered a prayer to a god who seemed to have forgotten her completely. She had no way of knowing that less than 50 miles away, in a cabin high in the Rocky Mountains, a man named Jacob Stone was cleaning his rifle and thinking about the rumors he'd heard in town about Marcus Jameson's expanding business interests. She had no way of knowing that her nightmare was about to become someone else's crusade, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob Stone had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 days when he first heard the rumors about Marcus Jameson's latest acquisition. The massive bull had taken an arrow meant for a clean kill, and Jacob's code wouldn't let him abandon a suffering animal to die slowly in the wilderness. Now, as he crouched beside the finally felled elk in a grove of golden aspens, he listened to the voices of 2 hunters making camp 100 yards downhill. "I tell you, Bill, I saw her with my own eyes," the first man was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Prettiest woman I ever laid eyes on, sitting in that fancy carriage like she was going to a church social instead of—" He lowered his voice, but Jacob's ears, trained by 15 years of mountain living, caught every word. Instead of being sold like cattle, Jacob's hands stilled on the elk's hide. He'd been preparing to field dress the animal, but something in the hunter's tone made him pause. "You sure it wasn't just some Denver lady traveling through?" The second man, Bill, asked. "Rich folks got strange ways about them. Nah, this was different. I was picking up supplies at Morrison's when I overheard Jameson's driver talking to the blacksmith. Said they was taking her to Denver, to one of them fancy houses where gentlemen pay for company. Driver said she was payment for some gambler's debt. $800 worth." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such arrangements before, mostly in the larger cities where desperate men sold their wives or daughters to settle debts. It was a practice that made his stomach turn and his hands itch for his Colt 45. 800. Christ almighty, that's a fortune. What kind of fool racks up that kind of debt? The kind that can't stay away from Jameson's poker tables, I reckon. Driver said the woman's husband practically threw her into the carriage himself. Wouldn't even look at her when they drove off. Jacob stood slowly, his 6'4" frame unfolding like a storm cloud gathering height. At 36, he was still built like the cavalry soldier he'd once been, before Shiloh and Gettysburg had shown him too much of what men could do to each other. His shoulders had only broadened in the years since he'd fled civilization for these mountains. His arms grown stronger from swinging an axe and working trap lines. His reflexes sharpened by constant vigilance against both animal and human predators. The hunters continued their conversation, but Jacob had heard enough. He finished his work on the elk with quick, efficient movements, his mind already shifting from hunter to something else entirely. Something more dangerous, Marcus Jameson. The name sat in Jacob's memory like a splinter. 3 years ago, Jameson's men had tried to force Jacob off his land, claiming it sat on a potential silver lode. They'd come with legal papers and brass badges, but Jacob had seen through their act immediately. When words failed, they'd tried violence. 2 of Jameson's hired guns had limped back to town with broken bones and ruined pride. Jameson had left Jacob alone since then, but the mountain man had always known it was a temporary truce. Now it seemed Jameson had moved on to even fouler business. Jacob hoisted the elk's haunches over his pack horse, secured the hide, and began the journey back to his cabin. But instead of taking the direct route through Eagle Pass, he found himself angling toward the main road that connected Silver Ridge to Denver. He told himself he was just curious, just wanted to confirm the hunter's story. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. The truth was, Jacob Stone had spent 15 years running from the memories of war, from the faces of men he'd killed and friends he'd failed to save. He'd built his sanctuary in these mountains, carved out a life where the only blood on his hands came from hunting for food, where the only battles he fought were against winter storms and hungry bears. But some battles came looking for you. No matter how far you ran, the road from Silver Ridge wound through a series of switchbacks as it descended toward the valley floor. Jacob positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that commanded a view of the entire route, dismounted and settled in to wait. If Jameson was moving a woman to Denver, they'd have to pass this way. The sun was high and warm for October, the aspen leaves catching the light like scattered gold coins. Jacob had always loved this time of year in the mountains, when the world seemed painted in shades of fire and honey. But today, the beauty felt hollow, tainted by what he expected to see. He didn't have to wait long. The carriage appeared around the bend below, its black lacquered sides gleaming in the sunlight. It was pulled by 4 matching bay horses and driven by one of Jameson's men, a scarred brute named Pete Hawkins, whom Jacob recognized from their previous encounter. Riding alongside were 2 more of Jameson's boys, both armed with rifles and wearing the arrogant expressions of men who believed their employer's money made them untouchable. But it was the figure in the carriage window that made Jacob's breath catch. Even at this distance, he could see she was beautiful. The hunters hadn't exaggerated. Auburn hair caught the sunlight, and her profile had the kind of delicate features that belonged in paintings, not in Marcus Jameson's clutches. She sat straight-backed and still, staring out at the passing landscape with an expression Jacob couldn't quite read from his perch. Resignation? Defiance? Fear? As the carriage drew closer to his position, Jacob made a decision that would change everything. He stood, stepped to the very edge of the outcropping and called out in a voice that carried like thunder across the mountainside. "Hold there!" The driver jerked the reins, bringing the carriage to a sudden stop. The two riders wheeled their horses, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Jacob remained motionless on the rocks above them, a dark silhouette against the sky, his rifle held casually across his arms. "Jacob Stone," Pete Hawkins spat, his voice thick with old resentment. "Should have known you'd stick your nose where it don't belong." "Just passing through, Pete," Jacob replied mildly. "Couldn't help but notice Jameson's traveling in style these days. New business venture?" One of the other riders, a young punk named Danny Reeves, laughed harshly. "None of your damn business, mountain man. Keep moving before we decide to finish what we started 3 years back." Jacob's eyes shifted to the carriage window. The woman was looking up at him now, and he could see her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, probably mid-20s, with eyes the color of storm clouds and skin that spoke of a life spent indoors, away from the harsh mountain sun. But it was the expression in those grey eyes that hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't resigned or defeated. She was angry. Furious, in fact, though she was hiding it behind a mask of ladylike composure. This wasn't a woman who'd accepted her fate. This was a woman planning to fight it somehow, some way. "Ma'am?" Jacob called down, touching the brim of his hat with careful politeness. "Jacob Stone at your service. You traveling of your own free will?" The question hung in the mountain air like smoke. Pete Hawkins' face darkened with rage. "Stone, you son of a—" "I asked the lady," Jacob cut him off, his voice taking on the edge it had carried during the war. When he'd been Sergeant Stone, and men had jumped to obey him, or found themselves face down in the mud. The woman in the carriage straightened even further, if that were possible. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily up to Jacob's position. "Sarah Beth Coleman, Mr. Stone. And no, I am not traveling of my own free will. I'm being transported to Denver against my wishes to settle a debt." The admission sent a shock through the group below. Danny Reeves reached for his pistol, but Pete Hawkins held up a warning hand. "Stone, this ain't your fight," Pete said, trying to sound reasonable. "This is legitimate business, all legal and proper." "The woman's husband signed papers." Jacob shifted his grip on his rifle, the movement subtle but unmistakable. "Funny thing about papers, Pete. They don't mean much when they're signed under duress. And they don't mean nothing at all when they involve trafficking women." "You calling Mr. Jameson a criminal?" Danny demanded, his hand still hovering near his gun. Jacob's smile was winter cold. "I'm saying Marcus Jameson deals in human misery. And I've got a philosophical objection to that kind of business." He began picking his way down the rocky slope with the sure-footed ease of a man who'd spent years navigating treacherous terrain. Each step brought him closer to the standoff that was building like a thunderhead on a summer afternoon. "Mrs. Coleman," he called out as he descended, never taking his eyes off Jameson's men. "If you could step out of that carriage, I'd be much obliged." "She stays put," Pete snarled, finally drawing his own weapon. "Stone, I'm warning you. You're warning me." Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Pete, last time we danced, you ended up eating dirt and crying for your mama. You sure you want to try that again?" He reached the road level, still 50 feet from the carriage, but close enough that his presence changed the entire dynamic. The horses sensed the tension, stamping and tossing their heads. Sarah Beth Coleman pressed her face to the carriage window, her grey eyes fixed on Jacob with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "I'll make you a deal. Boys," Jacob said conversationally, as if discussing the weather, "you turn that carriage around, take Mrs. Coleman back to Silver Ridge, and we'll call it even. Nobody has to get hurt, and you can tell Jameson that Jacob Stone sends his regards." Danny Reeves spat in the dust. "And if we refuse?" Jacob's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle coiling like a mountain cat preparing to spring. "Well, then I reckon we'll have ourselves a problem. And Pete here can tell you I'm real good at solving problems." The standoff stretched taut. 5 armed men and 1 desperate woman balanced on the knife's edge of violence. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Then Sarah Beth Coleman made the choice for all of them. The carriage door opened with a sharp crack, and she stepped out into the road, her chin lifted defiantly. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jacob could see in her hands. "I accept your assistance." All hell broke loose. Pete Hawkins raised his rifle, but Jacob was already moving, 15 years of mountain living having honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. He dove to the side as Pete's shot rang out, the bullet whining off a rock where he'd been standing. Danny Reeves went for his pistol, but Jacob's rifle spoke first. The heavy 45-70 slug, taking the young gunman in the shoulder and spinning him out of his saddle. The third man, caught flat-footed by the sudden violence, tried to wheel his horse around and flee. Jacob worked the lever action smoothly, chambering another round, but didn't fire. The man got the message and spurred his mount into a gallop back towards Silver Ridge. Pete Hawkins, meanwhile, was trying to reload while keeping his terrified horse under control. Jacob rose from his crouch like an avenging angel, strode across the intervening distance, and grabbed Pete's bridle. "Easy there, Pete," he said quietly. "Fight's over." Pete looked down at him, at the rifle muzzle now pointed at his chest, and slowly raised his hands. "Jameson ain't gonna stand for this, Stone. He'll come for you with everything he's got. Let him come." Jacob's voice was flat, emotionless. "I've been waiting 3 years for Marcus Jameson to show his true colors. Looks like today's the day." He stepped back, gestured with his rifle toward Silver Ridge. "You and your friend there," he nodded toward Danny, who was clutching his wounded shoulder and moaning, "Get back to town. Tell Jameson that Sarah Beth Coleman is under my protection now. Tell him if he wants her, he can come to my mountain and try to take her." Pete helped Danny back onto his horse, both men pale with shock and pain. As they prepared to ride away, Pete called back, "Stone, you don't know what you're getting into. Jameson's got influence, got connections. He'll destroy you." Jacob's smile was grim. "Pete, I've been destroyed before. It didn't take." As the two defeated men rode away, Jacob turned to face Sarah Beth Coleman. She stood beside the abandoned carriage, her traveling dress dusty from the road, her grey eyes wide with shock at the sudden violence. But there was something else in her expression now, something that hadn't been there before. "Hope, ma'am," Jacob said, touching his hat brim again. "Jacob Stone, and I believe I made you a promise back there." She looked at him for a long moment. This mountain man who had just turned her world upside down, who had faced down 3 armed men as casually as another man might swat a fly. "What kind of promise, Mr. Stone?" His eyes, pale blue as winter sky, met hers steadily. "The kind that means Marcus Jameson will never lay a hand on you. The kind that means you're free, Mrs. Coleman, free to choose your own path." The mountain wind stirred the golden aspen leaves around them. And somewhere in the distance, that hawk called out as it rode the thermals toward the high peaks. Sarah Beth Coleman looked up at those mountains, at the wild country that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The nightmare was far from over. But for the first time since Thomas had spoken those fatal words in Murphy's saloon, she had an ally, a protector, a chance. The abandoned carriage sat like a black beetle on the dusty mountain road, its elegant appointments now seeming absurdly out of place in the wilderness. Jacob Stone circled it slowly, his experienced eyes cataloguing details that might prove useful later. The interior was fitted with burgundy velvet seats and brass fixtures that probably cost more than most families in Silver Ridge earned in a year. Jameson's taste for luxury, even in his criminal enterprises, would be his weakness. Sarah Beth Coleman stood uncertainly beside the vehicle, her traveling dress, a deep blue wool with pearl buttons that had probably been her finest garment, now wrinkled and dusty from the day's events. She clutched a small carpet bag that contained, Jacob assumed, whatever possessions she'd been allowed to bring on her involuntary journey to Denver. "Can you ride, Mrs. Coleman?" Jacob asked, nodding toward the 4 bay horses still hitched to the carriage. They were quality animals, well-fed and properly trained, worth a small fortune in their own right. Yes, she replied, though uncertainty flickered in her grey eyes. It's been some time since I've ridden anything but a gentle mare, but I can manage. Jacob began unhitching the lead horses, his movements efficient and sure. We'll take 2 of these beauties and turn the others loose. They'll find their way back to town eventually, and it'll slow down any pursuit Jameson might send after us. As he worked, Sarah Beth moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Mr. Stone, I need you to understand something. My husband, Thomas, he owes Marcus Jameson $800. That's not a debt that simply disappears because I've escaped. Jameson will come after both of us now, and he won't stop until he collects what he believes is owed. Jacob paused in his work, meeting her gaze directly. Mrs. Coleman, I've been dealing with men like Marcus Jameson since I was old enough to hold a rifle. They're all the same, bullies who mistake cruelty for strength. The only language they understand is force, and I happen to speak that language fluently. He finished freeing the lead horses and fashioned makeshift bridles from the leather traces. Besides, you're not property to be bought and sold. No matter what papers your husband might have signed, no matter what debts he owes, you're a human being with rights. And I intend to make sure those rights are respected. Sarah Beth watched him work, noting the way his large hands moved with surprising gentleness as he calmed the horses. You're risking everything for a stranger, Mr. Stone. Why? The question hung in the mountain air while Jacob considered his answer. How could he explain the demons that had driven him to these mountains? How could he tell her about the faces that haunted his dreams, the friends he'd been unable to save during the war, the crushing weight of survivors' guilt that had made civilization unbearable? Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people stand by and let evil flourish, he said finally. I won't be one of those people anymore. He helped her mount one of the horses, noting how she sat the animal with natural grace despite her obvious nervousness. She'd been raised with some refinement, that much was clear, but there was steel beneath the ladylike exterior. She wouldn't break easily, and that was good. The next few days would test them both. Where are we going? She asked as Jacob swung onto his own mount with fluid ease. My cabin, up in the high country. It's about a 6-hour ride, but it's defensible ground. Jameson's men won't be able to approach without me knowing about it well in advance. They set off at a steady pace, leaving the main road to follow a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of aspen and pine. The afternoon sun slanted through the golden leaves, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their path. It should have been beautiful, but Jacob's attention was focused entirely on their surroundings, watching for signs of pursuit. For the first hour they rode in relative silence, Sarah Beth focusing on staying seated while her horse picked its way over increasingly rough terrain. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, she began to relax slightly in the saddle, and conversation became easier. Tell me about Thomas, Jacob said suddenly. How long has he been gambling? Sarah Beth's face tightened with old pain. It started small, maybe 3 years ago. A few dollars at the saloon on Saturday nights, nothing that seemed dangerous. But then he began going more frequently, staying later, losing more money. He told me it was just entertainment, that he had everything under control. They always say that, Jacob observed grimly. By last year, he was disappearing for days at a time, coming home with his pockets empty and excuses on his lips. He sold my mother's jewelry, claimed it was for supplies we needed for the farm. Then he mortgaged the land, said he was investing in mining equipment that would make us rich. Her voice grew bitter. I should have left him then. Should have seen what he was becoming. But I kept hoping the man I married would come back, that he would remember who he used to be. And now? Sarah Beth was quiet for a long moment, her grey eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Now I realized that man was probably never real to begin with. Thomas always took the easy path, always looked for shortcuts to success. The gambling was just the latest in a long line of poor choices. They emerged onto a high meadow where the grass grew tall and golden, swaying in the mountain breeze. Jacob called a halt to rest the horses and check their back trail. Through his field glasses, he could see dust rising from the road far below, riders moving fast toward Silver Ridge. "Pete and Danny made good time getting back to town," he said, lowering the glasses. "Jameson will know what happened within the hour." Sarah Beth dismounted and walked to the edge of the meadow, where the ground fell away in a steep slope toward the valley. The view was breathtaking, endless ridges rolling away toward the horizon like frozen waves, painted in every shade of gold and green and blue. "It's beautiful up here," she said softly. "I can see why you choose to live away from civilization." Jacob joined her at the overlook, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "I came up here to escape the world," he said. "Seemed like every time I got involved in other people's problems, good men ended up dead. I figured I'd done enough damage. What changed your mind?" He was quiet for so long she didn't think he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old grief. "I had a younger brother, David. Good kid, believed in right and wrong, wanted to make the world better. He followed me into the army when the war started, said he wanted to fight beside me for the Union cause." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I was his sergeant. I was supposed to keep him safe, look out for him. Instead, I watched him die at Gettysburg, torn apart by canister shot while I was too far away to help." Sarah Beth felt her heart clench with sympathy. She reached out instinctively, her small hand covering his clenched fist. "I'm sorry. After the war, I couldn't stand being around people anymore. Couldn't stand the weight of their expectations, their faith that I could somehow protect them from the ugliness in the world. So I ran to these mountains and told myself I was done fighting other people's battles." He turned to look at her directly, his pale blue eyes intense with conviction. "But when I saw you in that carriage, heard about what Jameson was planning to do to you, I couldn't walk away. Maybe because you reminded me of someone who needed protecting. Maybe because I'm tired of running from who I used to be." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then Jacob stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should keep moving. I want to reach the cabin before full dark." The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as they climbed higher into the mountains. Sarah Beth's horse struggled with the rocky terrain, and more than once Jacob had to dismount and lead both animals over particularly difficult passages. Her respect for his woodcraft grew with each mile. He moved through this wilderness like he was part of it, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed stones that were invisible to her city-bred eyes. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, they finally emerged onto a high shelf of granite that jutted out from the mountainside like a natural fortress. Jacob's cabin sat at the back of the shelf, built from massive logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. It was larger than Sarah Beth had expected, with a stone chimney that spoke of warmth and comfort, and windows that commanded sweeping views of the approaches from below. "Home sweet home," Jacob said, helping her down from her horse. "It's not much, but it's defensible." Sarah Beth looked around the small homestead with growing amazement. There was a barn built into a natural cave in the rock face, a workshop filled with handmade tools, a garden plot where late vegetables still grew despite the advancing season. Jacob Stone hadn't just been surviving up here. He'd been living, creating a life of purpose and self-sufficiency far from the corruptions of civilization. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You built all this yourself?" "Took me 5 years to get it the way I wanted it," Jacob replied, unsaddling the horses with practiced efficiency. "But I had plenty of time and not much else to do." As they settled the animals in the barn, Sarah Beth became aware of how exhausted she was. The emotional trauma of the past day, combined with hours in the saddle, had drained her reserves completely. Jacob must have noticed her fatigue because he guided her toward the cabin with gentle courtesy. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, furnished with handmade chairs and tables that showed real craftsmanship. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while shelves lined with books covered another. It was the home of an educated man, someone who valued learning and beauty despite his self-imposed exile. "You can have the bedroom," Jacob said, indicating a door that led off the main room. "I'll bed down out here by the fire." Sarah Beth started to protest, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Mrs. Coleman, you've been through hell today. You need rest, and you need to feel safe. I give you my word as a gentleman that your privacy will be absolutely respected under my roof." She looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity and concern. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt truly safe. "Thank you, Mr. Stone, for everything." As she prepared for bed in the small but comfortable bedroom, Sarah Beth could hear Jacob moving around the cabin, securing doors and windows, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. She knew Jameson would come. Men like him couldn't afford to let challenges to their authority go unanswered, but for tonight she was safe. For tonight she could rest without fear. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The real battle was yet to come. Sarah Beth woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying, luxuries she hadn't expected to find in a mountain cabin. Sunlight streamed through the single window of the small bedroom, revealing details she'd been too exhausted to notice the night before. The walls were lined with cedar planks that Jacob had obviously cut and fitted himself, and the furniture, a simple dresser, washstand, and chair, showed the same careful craftsmanship she'd observed throughout the cabin. On the dresser sat a basin of warm water, a clean towel, and what appeared to be women's clothing. Sarah Beth sat up in confusion, then noticed a note written in Jacob's careful script. "Mrs. Coleman, these belong to my late sister-in-law, Mary. She was about your size. Please make use of anything you need. Breakfast will be ready when you are. J. Stone." The clothes were simple but well made, a brown wool skirt, white cotton blouse, sturdy boots, and undergarments that had been carefully laundered and stored. Sarah Beth held up the blouse, wondering about this Mary and how her belongings had come to be in Jacob's mountain retreat. Another piece of the puzzle that was Jacob Stone. Another glimpse into the life he'd lived before becoming a hermit. When she emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, dressed in the borrowed clothes that fit her surprisingly well, she found Jacob standing at the stove, tending to what smelled like the finest breakfast she'd had in months. He glanced up as she entered, his pale blue eyes taking in her appearance with a quick, assessing look. "The clothes suit you," he said simply. "Mary was about your height, though perhaps not quite as slender. She always said mountain living would put meat on her bones," but he trailed off, returning his attention to the pan with more focus than bacon probably required. Sarah Beth sensed another painful memory lurking beneath the surface and chose not to push. "Thank you for the clothes, and for your kindness," she said instead. "I can't remember the last time someone went to such trouble for my comfort." Jacob served eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread that he'd obviously baked himself. The food was simple but delicious, and Sarah Beth found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't felt in weeks. It occurred to her that she'd been gradually starving in Silver Ridge, as Thomas spent their money on cards and dice, making do with whatever scraps remained after his gambling losses. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked between bites. "Coming on 16 years now," Jacob replied, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "Built this place from nothing but rock and timber, one log at a time. It must get lonely." He was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing, Mrs. Coleman. I chose solitude. Loneliness is what you feel when you're surrounded by people who don't understand you, or when the people you care about are beyond your reach." His eyes grew distant. "I was lonely every day of the war, surrounded by thousands of soldiers. Up here I'm just alone, and that's different. Better in most ways." After breakfast, Jacob began what Sarah Beth quickly realized was a methodical preparation for siege. He moved through the cabin and surrounding area with military precision, checking supplies, weapons, and defensive positions. She watched, fascinated despite the grim circumstances, as he transformed from the gentle host of breakfast into something altogether more dangerous. "Can I help?" she asked, as he inventoried boxes of ammunition in the workshop. Jacob paused, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "You ever fire a gun, Mrs. Coleman?" "Sarah Beth, please." "And yes, my father taught me to shoot when I was young. He said every frontier woman should know how to protect herself." "Good man, your father." Jacob selected a Winchester rifle from a rack on the wall, checked its action, and handed it to her. "This is a 44-40, same as my Colt. Easier to keep track of ammunition that way." "You remember how to work the lever action?" Sarah Beth took the rifle, surprised by its weight, and worked the action smoothly. The movements came back to her after years of disuse, muscle memory awakened by necessity. "I think so. It's been a long time, but some things you don't forget. We'll do some practice shooting later, when I'm satisfied we're not being watched. For now, let's focus on other preparations." He led her through the cabin, pointing out details she'd missed in the previous evening's exhaustion. The windows weren't just glass. They had heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside, with gun ports cut at strategic angles. The walls were thicker than they appeared, double-logged with sand and stone packed between for extra protection. The door was reinforced with iron bands, and Jacob showed her a heavy beam that could be dropped into brackets to bar it completely. "This isn't just a home," Sarah Beth realized aloud. "It's a fortress. I told you, I've dealt with men like Jameson before. Sometimes the best defense is making sure your enemy knows attacking you will be more costly than it's worth." The workshop contained not just tools, but supplies that spoke of serious preparation. Barrels of flour, beans and salt pork, medical supplies including laudanum and surgical instruments. Enough ammunition to outfit a small army. Jacob had clearly been expecting trouble for a long time. "How many men do you think he'll send?" Sarah Beth asked. "Depends how seriously he takes the threat to his reputation," Jacob replied, checking the action on a shotgun. "Could be as few as 6 or 8, could be 20 or more. Jameson's got influence in Silver Ridge, but he also has enemies. If word spreads that he's trafficking women, some of the more respectable citizens might start asking uncomfortable questions." They spent the morning organizing supplies and defensive positions. Sarah Beth found herself oddly comforted by the methodical preparations. After months of helplessly watching Thomas spiral into addiction and debt, it felt good to be taking concrete action, even if that action was preparing for a fight. Around midday, Jacob called a halt to their work. "Time for that shooting practice," he said, leading her to a natural firing range behind the cabin where the mountainside formed a safe backstop. He set up targets at various distances and handed her the Winchester. "Show me what your father taught you." Sarah Beth took aim at the closest target, a pine board about 50 yards away, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but her shot struck within inches of the center mark. Jacob nodded approvingly. "Good. Now try the farther one." For the next hour he put her through her paces with both rifle and pistol. Her marksmanship was rusty but solid, and she could see Jacob's approval growing with each shot. More importantly, she felt her own confidence returning. For too long, she'd been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Now, with a weapon in her hands and knowledge in her head, she was becoming something else. A survivor. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob shared more of his knowledge. He showed her how to read the mountain weather, how to spot signs of approaching riders, how to move silently through the forest. Each lesson was practical, focused on survival, but Sarah Beth sensed there was more to it than mere preparation for Jameson's attack. "You're teaching me to live up here," she said during a break in their training. Jacob leaned against a pine tree, his weathered hands automatically checking the loads in his Colt. "I'm teaching you to be self-sufficient. Whether that's up here or somewhere else entirely, that's your choice to make. What if I chose to stay?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, surprising them both. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "This is a hard life. Sarah Beth, winters that'll freeze your blood, isolation that drives some folks mad, constant vigilance against both nature and men who might mean you harm. It's not the life you were raised for. The life I was raised for ended when my husband sold me to pay his gambling debts, she replied quietly. Maybe it's time I learned to live a different kind of life. Before Jacob could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Both of them grabbed their weapons and took cover behind the woodpile as a single rider emerged from the tree line below the cabin. It was a young man Sarah Beth didn't recognize, riding a lathered horse and looking constantly over his shoulder as if being pursued. Jacob kept his rifle trained on the stranger as he approached. "That's close enough, friend," Jacob called out. "State your business." The rider pulled up short, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Mr. Stone? I'm Billy Garrett from Silver Ridge. I got a message for you from Doc Harrison." Jacob knew Harrison, the town's physician, and one of the few men in Silver Ridge with the backbone to stand up to Marcus Jameson. "What's the message?" "Doc says Jameson's recruiting men from outside the territory. Hard cases from Denver and Colorado Springs. Word is he's offered $1,000 to whoever brings you in, and another 1,000 for the woman." Sarah Beth felt ice water flood her veins. $2,000 was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. It would draw killers and bounty hunters from 3 states. "How many men?" Jacob asked, his voice deadly calm. "Don't know for sure, but Doc heard tell of at least 15, maybe 20. They're gathering at Jameson's place, waiting for word on when to move." Jacob lowered his rifle slightly. "Why's Doc Harrison warning us?" Billy Garrett shifted nervously in his saddle. "Because he says what Jameson's doing ain't right, and somebody needs to make a stand. Doc also wanted me to tell you that Mrs. Coleman's husband left town this morning, headed east on the Denver stage, far as anyone knows." The news hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. Thomas had abandoned her completely, fleeing while she faced the consequences of his weakness. Part of her had hoped, despite everything, that he might try to help her somehow. Now that last illusion was gone. "Thank Doc for the warning," Jacob told Billy, "and tell him to keep his head down. Things are about to get dangerous in Silver Ridge." After the young man rode away, Jacob and Sarah Beth stood in silence, absorbing the implications of what they'd learned. 20 armed men, professional killers motivated by more money than they could earn in years of honest work. Even Jacob's mountain fortress might not be enough against those odds. "I could surrender," Sarah Beth said quietly. "End this before more people get hurt." Jacob turned to face her, his expression fierce. "Over my dead body. You're not property to be handed over to the highest bidder, and I'll be damned if I let Jameson profit from trafficking women." "Then what do we do?" Jacob's smile was grim but determined. "We make them pay such a price for coming after us that every hard case in 3 territories will think twice before taking Jameson's money again." As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Sarah Beth felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the fierce satisfaction of choosing her own fate. Whatever came next, she would face it as a free woman, not a victim. The war for her freedom was about to begin in earnest. The evening sky blazed crimson behind the mountain peaks as Jacob Stone sat on his cabin porch, methodically cleaning his rifle while Sarah Beth mended a tear in her borrowed skirt. The domestic scene felt surreal, given the violence they both knew was coming, yet somehow it also felt right. 2 souls finding peace in simple tasks while storm clouds gathered on the horizon. "Tell me about Mary," Sarah Beth said quietly, not looking up from her needlework. The question had been building in her mind all day. Curiosity about the woman whose clothes she now wore, whose memory seemed to cast such a shadow over Jacob's carefully ordered life. Jacob's hands stilled on the rifle's action. For a moment, Sarah Beth thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "Mary was my brother David's wife. They married just before the war started, had barely 6 months together before he enlisted." Jacob resumed his cleaning, but his movements had become mechanical, distant. "She was the finest woman I ever knew, kind, intelligent, brave as any soldier I served with. When David was killed at Gettysburg, I thought Mary would fall apart. Instead, she got stronger. Sarah Beth set down her sewing, sensing the importance of this story. What happened to her? After the war, I was broken. Couldn't stand being around people. Couldn't sleep without seeing the faces of dead men. Couldn't find any purpose in a world that seemed bent on destroying everything good and decent. Jacob's voice grew rougher. Mary took it upon herself to fix me, the way she might have nursed a wounded bird back to health. He stood and walked to the porch railing, gazing out at the darkening valley below. She convinced me to come west, said the mountains might heal what the war had damaged. We traveled together, along with her younger sister Ruth, looking for a place where we could start over. Sarah Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Ruth, 15 years old, sweet as spring flowers, full of dreams about the frontier life she'd read about in dime novels. Jacob's knuckles went white as he gripped the railing. We were camped in a valley about 20 miles from here when the raiders found us. 5 men who'd been expelled from every decent town in Colorado for rape, murder, theft, the worst kind of human vermin. The story unfolded like a nightmare in the gathering darkness. Jacob had been hunting when the attack came, returning to find their camp destroyed, Mary and Ruth taken. He'd tracked the raiders for 3 days through some of the most treacherous country in the Rockies, following a trail marked by torn clothing and worse signs. When I finally caught up with them, it was too late for Ruth. Jacob's voice cracked. They'd used her up and thrown her away like garbage. Mary was still alive, but barely. They'd kept her for their amusement, planning to sell her in one of the mining camps where women were scarce and questions weren't asked. Sarah Beth felt tears stinging her eyes. "Dear God, I killed all 5 of them," Jacob continued, his voice now flat and emotionless. "Not clean, not quick, not like a soldier. I made them suffer the way they'd made Mary and Ruth suffer. And when it was over, when I'd had my revenge, Mary looked at me with such fear in her eyes. Not fear of them, but fear of me, of what I'd become." He turned back to face Sarah Beth, his pale blue eyes haunted. "She lived for another 2 weeks, long enough for me to bring her up here and nurse her as best I could. But her spirit was broken, and her body couldn't heal from what they'd done to her. She died in the bedroom where you slept last night, holding my hand and making me promise to find some way to live with the darkness inside me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding. Sarah Beth saw now why Jacob had withdrawn from the world, why he'd built his fortress in the mountains and sworn off human contact. He'd failed to protect the people he loved most, and that failure had nearly destroyed him. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. "I can't imagine carrying that kind of pain. For 12 years, I convinced myself that isolation was the answer," Jacob replied, settling back into his chair. "I told myself that if I stayed away from people, I couldn't fail them again. Couldn't watch them suffer because of my mistakes." He looked at her directly, his gaze intense and searching. "But yesterday when I saw you in that carriage, I realized I'd been lying to myself. The darkness Mary was afraid of, it wasn't the capacity for violence. Violence was just a tool, no different from this rifle. The real darkness was the willingness to stand by and let evil flourish, because it was safer than risking failure again." Sarah Beth felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of truth that resonated to her bones. "Is that why you helped me? To prove something to yourself?" "Maybe at first," Jacob admitted, "but not anymore." The simple statement hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Instead, Sarah Beth returned to her sewing while Jacob finished cleaning his rifle, both of them content to let the moment settle into something deeper than words. As full darkness fell over the mountain, they moved inside where Jacob built up the fire, and Sarah Beth prepared a simple supper from his well-stocked pantry. The domestic routine felt natural, as if they'd been sharing these small intimacies for years rather than days. She found herself studying his profile as he read from a leather-bound book of poetry, noting the way firelight softened the harsh lines that hardship had carved into his features. "You're not what I expected when I first heard about the mountain man," she said. Nodding toward his book, Jacob looked up, one eyebrow raised in amusement. What were you expecting? Animal skins and grunted conversations? Something like that, Sarah Beth laughed, the sound surprising them both. It had been so long since she'd found genuine amusement in anything. Most of the men I've known would rather die than be caught reading poetry. Whitman and Thoreau have been better company than most people I've met, Jacob replied. They understand something about solitude, about finding meaning in the natural world. He marked his place in the book and set it aside. What about you? What did you dream of before Thomas? Before everything went wrong? The question caught Sarah Beth off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her dreams, her wants, her hopes for the future. Thomas had been consumed by his gambling addiction, unable to see beyond his next game, his next potential big win. I wanted children, she said finally. A real home, not just a house, but a place filled with laughter and love. I wanted to teach my daughters to read, to be strong and independent. I wanted to watch my sons grow into good men who would treat their wives with respect and kindness. Her voice grew wistful. I had this fantasy about Sunday dinners with my grown children and their families, all of us gathered around a big table, sharing stories and making memories. It seems foolish now. It doesn't seem foolish at all, Jacob said gently. It seems like the most natural thing in the world to want. What about you? Before the war, before everything that happened to Mary and Ruth, what did you want from life? Jacob was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted to be a teacher. Had this idea about starting a school in one of the frontier towns, helping children learn to read and write and think for themselves. I believed education could make the world better, could keep people from making the same mistakes over and over. He laughed bitterly. Seems like a lifetime ago that I was that naive. Maybe you still could be, Sarah Beth suggested carefully. Maybe it's not too late to find a different kind of purpose. Before Jacob could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the distant howl of wolves echoing across the valley. But this wasn't the natural call of wild animals. This was a signal, 3 long howls followed by 2 short ones, repeated twice. Jacob was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the oil lamp and moving to the window. That's not wolves, he said grimly. That's men signaling each other. Jameson's hired guns are positioning themselves around the mountain. Sarah Beth felt her blood turn to ice water. How many? Hard to tell from the signals, but more than I hoped and fewer than I feared. Maybe 10 or 12. Jacob moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and ammunition. They'll wait until dawn to attack. Professionals always prefer to fight in good light. What do we do? Jacob paused in his preparations, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. We make them regret taking Jameson's money. But Sarah Beth, I need you to understand something. Tomorrow people are going to die. Maybe me, maybe you, certainly some of them. Are you prepared for that? She thought about Thomas, about the years of disappointment and betrayal, about the humiliation of being sold like property to pay a gambling debt. She thought about Mary and Ruth, innocent women destroyed by evil men who faced no consequences for their actions. She thought about all the Sarah Beth Colemans who might suffer in the future if Marcus Jameson wasn't stopped. Yes, she said firmly. I'm prepared. Jacob nodded, something like pride flickering in his pale blue eyes. Then get some rest while you can. Tomorrow we find out what we're really made of. As Sarah Beth prepared for what might be her last night on Earth, she realized that somewhere in the past 2 days, she'd stopped being a victim. She'd become something else entirely, a woman who would fight for her freedom. No matter the cost, outside the wolves howled again, and this time there was no mistaking the human intelligence behind the sound. The net was closing around Jacob's mountain fortress, and come morning, there would be a reckoning that would determine not just their fate, but whether justice or corruption would triumph in this small corner of the Colorado Territory. In the bedroom that had once been Mary's deathbed, Sarah Beth Coleman said her prayers and prepared to make her stand. Dawn came grey and bitter to the high country, with frost coating the cabin windows and a wind that carried the promise of an early winter. Sarah Beth woke to the soft sound of Jacob moving through the cabin, his footsteps careful but purposeful as he made final preparations for the battle they both knew was coming. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes he'd provided. Mary's clothes, she reminded herself with a pang of grief for a woman she'd never met. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jacob standing at the kitchen window, a cup of coffee in his hands and his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. "They're out there," he said quietly, not turning from his vigil. "Started moving into position about an hour before first light. Professional work. They know what they're doing." Sarah Beth joined him at the window, accepting the cup of coffee he'd poured for her. The liquid was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed to cut through the fog of fear that threatened to cloud her thinking. Through the frosted glass, she could see nothing but the familiar landscape of pine trees and granite outcroppings, but she trusted Jacob's instincts completely. "How many?" she asked. "I count at least 14, maybe more. They're good at staying hidden, but they can't move without disturbing the wildlife. The birds have been telling me stories all morning." Jacob's pale blue eyes were alert and calculating. "They've got us surrounded, but they're being cautious. Word of what happened to Pete Hawkins and Danny Reeves has spread. They know I'm not going to roll over and surrender." Through his field glasses, Jacob had been tracking the mercenaries for over an hour. They were indeed professionals, armed with modern rifles and equipped for a siege. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd never fought a man who knew these mountains the way Jacob did, who'd spent 16 years learning every trail, every cave, every defensive advantage the terrain could provide. "There's something else," Jacob continued, his voice grim. "I spotted Marcus Jameson himself about half a mile down the mountain, sitting pretty in a fancy tent with a couple of bodyguards. He's come to watch the show personally." Sarah Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. The image of Jameson sitting in comfort while hired killers did his dirty work filled her with a rage she didn't know she possessed. This man had destroyed her life, corrupted her husband, and turned her into property to be bought and sold, all for money that meant nothing to him beyond a demonstration of his power. "I want to face him," she said suddenly. "When this is over, I want to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what I think of men who trade in human misery." Jacob turned from the window to study her face, noting the steel in her grey eyes and the set of her jaw. "You've changed, Sarah Beth. When I first saw you in that carriage, you looked like a victim. Now—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Now you look like a woman who could stare down the devil himself." Before Sarah Beth could respond, the morning stillness was shattered by a voice calling from somewhere beyond the tree line. It was cultured, educated, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of getting one's way through intimidation and bribery. "Jacob Stone." The voice echoed off the granite faces surrounding the cabin. "This is Marcus Jameson. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jacob moved to the door, keeping his rifle ready but not visible from outside. "I don't see anything around here that belongs to you, Jameson. Unless you're talking about those horses your boys abandoned on the road yesterday." Jameson's laughter carried easily through the thin mountain air. "Come now, Mr. Stone. We're both civilized men. Surely we can reach an accommodation that doesn't require bloodshed." "I'm prepared to be generous. I'm listening," Jacob called back, though his expression told Sarah Beth he had no intention of negotiating. "The woman represents a significant investment on my part. $800, plus expenses for transportation and accommodations. Return her unharmed, and I'll consider our business concluded. You can keep the horses as compensation for your inconvenience." Sarah Beth felt her temper flare at being discussed like livestock, but Jacob laid a calming hand on her arm. He was playing for time, she realized, using Jameson's arrogance against him. "And if I refuse," Jacob called out, "then I'm afraid things will become unpleasant." I have 15 very capable men positioned around your mountain, Mr. Stone. All of them veterans of various conflicts, all of them well compensated for their time. They have orders to take the woman alive, but Jameson's voice carried a note of false regret. Accidents do happen in these situations. Jacob's grip on his rifle tightened, but his voice remained steady. You're assuming your men are good enough to take this position, Jameson. That's a dangerous assumption to make, perhaps. But I'm also assuming you're not quite ready to die for a woman you barely know. After all, what is she to you? A chance encounter, a moment of misplaced chivalry. Is she really worth your life? The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Sarah Beth found herself holding her breath, waiting for Jacob's response. She knew logically that he owed her nothing. They'd known each other for barely 2 days, and his intervention in her plight had already far exceeded what any reasonable person could expect from a stranger. When Jacob finally answered, his voice carried across the mountainside with the authority of a man who'd found his purpose again. Marcus Jameson. I fought in a war that killed 600,000 men, all because some people believed they had the right to buy and sell other human beings. I watched friends die in that war, good men who believed that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. He paused, and Sarah Beth could see him drawing himself up to his full, imposing height. You ask what this woman is to me? She's a reminder that the war isn't over as long as men like you think you can purchase human dignity with dirty money. She's a line in the sand, Jameson, and you're not going to cross it. The silence that followed Jacob's declaration seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then Jameson's voice returned, stripped of its earlier civility and revealing the cold menace beneath. So be it, Mr. Stone. But understand this, when my men are finished with you, I'm going to make sure the woman suffers for every minute of trouble you've caused me. She'll spend the rest of her short life wishing you'd minded your own business. We'll see about that, Jacob replied. But he was already moving away from the door. His conversation with Jameson concluded. Over the next hour, Jacob shared his knowledge of the surrounding terrain and the defensive measures he'd built into his mountain retreat. The cabin itself was positioned to command excellent fields of fire in 3 directions, with the 4th side protected by a sheer granite cliff. He'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of siege, creating overlapping zones of defense that would force attackers to expose themselves to deadly crossfire. The key is making them come to us on our terms, he explained as they positioned ammunition and spare weapons at strategic points throughout the cabin. They have numbers, but we have position and intimate knowledge of the ground. Every advantage they think they have can be turned against them if we're smart about it. Sarah Beth found herself thinking about Mary and Ruth, about the evil men who destroyed Jacob's first attempt at building a family in this wilderness. There was a symmetry to the situation that felt almost like fate. Once again, Jacob Stone would make his stand against those who preyed on the innocent and defenseless. But this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't be arriving too late to save the people he cared about. The first shot came just after 10 o'clock. A rifle bullet that shattered one of the cabin's side windows and buried itself in the log wall 6 inches from Sarah Beth's head. She dropped instinctively to the floor, while Jacob moved to a prepared firing position at the front window. So much for negotiation, he muttered, then raised his voice to Carrie outside. Is that the best you've got, boys? My grandmother shot better than that, and she was blind in one eye. The taunt drew another volley of shots, but these were more disciplined, aimed at specific points where Jameson's men thought they might catch a glimpse of their targets. Jacob had anticipated this, positioning himself so that he could observe the attacker's muzzle flashes without exposing himself to return fire. 3 men on the left, maybe 4, he reported to Sarah Beth. 2 more in the rocks above the barn, 1 behind the big pine to the right. They're trying to establish a crossfire, but they don't know about the firing ports I cut in the back wall. For the next several minutes, the mountainside erupted in sporadic gunfire as Jameson's mercenaries probed for weaknesses in the cabin's defenses. Jacob responded selectively, never revealing all his positions, always making his shots count. Twice, Sarah Beth heard screams of pain from beyond the tree line, indicating that Jacob's return fire had found its mark. But the attackers were learning too, adjusting their tactics based on each exchange. They began coordinating their movements, laying down suppressing fire, while others maneuvered to better positions. It was clear that these weren't the usual frontier ruffians Jacob had dealt with before. These were men who'd fought in wars, who understood the deadly mathematics of assault and defense. Around noon, the attack suddenly ceased. An eerie quiet settled over the mountain, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley. Jacob used the lull to check their ammunition supplies and tend to a shallow cut on Sarah Beth's arm, where flying splinters had caught her during one of the exchanges. "They're regrouping," he said grimly, "probably trying to figure out how to get close enough to use dynamite or fire arrows." "This is just the beginning, Sarah Beth. The real fight hasn't started yet." As if summoned by his words, Jameson's voice rang out again across the mountainside. But this time it carried a new note of cruel satisfaction. "Mr. Stone, I have a special message for you and your lady friend. It seems we have a mutual acquaintance who'd like a word with you." Another voice joined Jameson's call, one that made Sarah Beth's blood run cold with recognition and disgust. "Sarah Beth. Sarah Beth, honey, it's me. It's Thomas. Please, you have to listen to me." Her husband had returned, and from the sound of his voice, he'd brought more than just words with him. Thomas Coleman's voice carried across the mountainside like a poison wind, each word a dagger thrust into what remained of Sarah Beth's heart. She pressed herself against the cabin wall, her hands trembling as the sound of her husband's desperate pleas mixed with the echo of gunfire still ringing in her ears. "Sarah Beth, please. You don't understand what you're doing." Thomas's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine anguish. "This man, this Jacob Stone, he's using you. He doesn't care about your safety. He's just trying to prove some point about his war." Jacob's jaw clenched as he peered through a gap in the shuttered window. "Don't listen to him, Sarah Beth. Whatever Jameson's paying him to say, whatever promises they've made—" "I can see him," Sarah Beth whispered, moving to another window, despite Jacob's gesture for her to stay down. Through the trees, she could make out a familiar figure standing beside Jameson's tent, his hands apparently bound behind his back, though she suspected it was all theater. Thomas looked haggard, his clothes wrinkled and stained, his hair unkempt. But his eyes held the same desperate cunning she'd seen too many times at their kitchen table, when he was spinning lies about his gambling losses. "She's my wife," Thomas called out again, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she knew so well. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I've come back to make things right. Sarah Beth, I've got a plan to pay off the debt, to start over somewhere new. Just come down here so we can talk." Jameson's cultured voice joined in, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "You see, Mr. Stone, this is what happens when you interfere in domestic disputes. Mr. Coleman has reconsidered his arrangements with me. He's prepared to work off his debt in other ways, mining labor perhaps, or service in one of my other enterprises. All perfectly legitimate, and all it requires," Thomas added quickly, "is for Sarah Beth to come home where she belongs. As my wife under my protection." Sarah Beth felt something cold and final settle in her chest. The last vestige of the 17-year-old girl who'd fallen in love with Thomas Coleman's easy smile died in that moment, replaced by a woman who finally understood the true nature of the man she'd married. Protection. She called out, her voice ringing clear and strong across the mountainside. "Is that what you call selling me to Marcus Jameson? Protection?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then Thomas's voice returned, smaller now, stripped of its false confidence. I was desperate, Sarah Beth, the debt, the threats. I wasn't thinking clearly. But I'm here now, and I want to make it right." Jacob had heard enough. He rose to his full height at the window, his rifle held ready, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops in battle. "Thomas Coleman, you yellow-bellied snake! You sold your own wife to pay gambling debts, then ran like a coward when the consequences came calling. Now you show up with the man who was going to turn her into a prostitute, and you want us to believe you've had a change of heart. You don't understand." Thomas's desperation was palpable now. "Jameson's men, they found me at the train station in Denver. They said if I didn't help them get Sarah Beth back, they'd kill me. They'd hunt me down no matter where I ran. So instead of facing your fate like a man, you decided to deliver your wife back into slavery." Jacob's contempt was withering. "You're not just a gambler and a coward, Coleman. You're a traitor to everything marriage is supposed to mean." Sarah Beth moved to stand beside Jacob at the window, no longer caring about the danger. When she spoke, her voice carried across the mountain with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Thomas Coleman, you ceased to be my husband the moment you put my name on the table in Marcus Jameson's poker game. Whatever happens here today, whatever the cost, I will never again be property to be bought, sold, or bargained away by weak men and their gambling debts." The words seemed to hang in the mountain air like a thunderclap. For a moment, even the mercenaries positioned around the cabin fell silent, perhaps recognizing the sound of a woman claiming her own destiny. Then Jameson's voice cut through the quiet, all pretense of civility finally abandoned. "How touching, how very noble. But I'm afraid nobility doesn't pay debts. Mrs. Coleman and Mr. Stone's heroics don't change the fact that you're outnumbered 15-2. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Jameson must have given some prearranged signal, because suddenly the mountainside erupted in coordinated violence. Rifle fire poured in from multiple directions. Not the probing shots of before, but a sustained barrage designed to keep Jacob and Sarah Beth pinned down, while other forces moved closer. Jacob immediately recognized the shift in tactics. "They're making their final push," he shouted over the din of gunfire. "Whatever Thomas told them about our defenses, they think they know enough to take us." But Thomas had never seen Jacob's true preparations. While the mercenaries concentrated their fire on the cabin's obvious weak points, Jacob activated defenses they couldn't have anticipated. Hidden firing ports opened in walls that appeared solid, revealing angles of attack that caught several mercenaries completely exposed. His carefully positioned ammunition caches allowed him to maintain devastating fields of fire from multiple positions, without ever showing himself for more than a few seconds. The first assault wave broke against Jacob's defenses. Like water against granite, 3 mercenaries went down in the opening minutes, their screams of pain and surprise echoing across the mountainside. The survivors fell back to regroup, but Jacob gave them no respite. He moved through the cabin like a deadly shadow, appearing at windows and firing ports just long enough to deliver precise, punishing shots before vanishing again. Sarah Beth proved herself more than capable under fire. Her marksmanship, honed during their practice sessions, allowed her to cover angles Jacob couldn't reach while he maneuvered to counter each new threat. The Winchester rifle felt natural in her hands now, an instrument of survival rather than an unfamiliar weapon. 2 more down on the left flank, she called out as her shot took a mercenary who'd been trying to work his way closer to the barn. "But there's movement in the rocks above. They're trying to get elevation on us." Jacob nodded grimly, already shifting to address the new threat. But even as he moved, he could see the mathematics of the situation working against them. His preparations were holding for now, but Jameson's men were learning from each failed assault, adapting their tactics, finding weaknesses in defenses that had seemed impregnable. The second wave came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated by men who understood how to use terrain and covering fire to maximum advantage. This time, they managed to reach the cabin's outer perimeter before Jacob's defensive fire could stop them entirely. Dynamite exploded against the north wall, blowing a hole in the logs large enough for a man to crawl through. "Sarah Beth, fall back to the bedroom," Jacob shouted as he rushed to defend the breach. "There's a rifle and ammunition in the chest by the window. Cover the back approaches." But even as she moved to obey, Sarah Beth could see that the tide was turning against them. Jacob was fighting magnificently, his years of mountain living and military experience combining to make him a formidable opponent. But he was still just one man against a professional force that had finally found the range and measure of his defenses. The third assault came with the fury of desperate men who'd lost too many comrades to retreat empty-handed. They poured through the breach in the north wall, while others laid down covering fire from protected positions. Jacob met them with rifle fire, and then, when they got too close for shooting, with the brutal hand-to-hand combat skills he'd learned in the Civil War, Sarah Beth watched in horrified fascination as Jacob Stone transformed into something primal and terrifying. The gentle mountain man who'd shared poetry with her by the fireplace vanished, replaced by a warrior who fought with the focused intensity of a natural predator. His knife flashed in the dim light, his fists struck with bone-crushing force. His rifle butt became a club that shattered skulls and broke ribs, but even Jacob's ferocity couldn't overcome simple mathematics. For every attacker he dropped, two more seemed to take his place. A rifle bullet creased his shoulder, another shattered the window beside his head, sending glass fragments across his face. He was bleeding from multiple wounds now, his movements beginning to slow with exhaustion and blood loss. That's when Sarah Beth Coleman made the most important decision of her life. Instead of staying in the bedroom as Jacob had ordered, she burst through the door with Mary's Winchester in her hands and determination written across her features. The sight of her seemed to galvanize Jacob, giving him renewed strength for what they both knew would be their final stand. Together, they held the cabin's main room against odds that should have overwhelmed them in seconds. Sarah Beth's rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, dropping attackers who thought they'd found safety behind overturned furniture. Jacob's military training combined with 16 years of mountain survival to create a fighting style that seemed to anticipate every threat, counter every attack, but it couldn't last forever. Eventually, Jacob's ammunition began to run low. His wounds began to tell, and the sheer weight of numbers started to overwhelm even his magnificent defenses. A thrown hatchet opened a gash across his forehead that poured blood into his eyes. A rifle bullet took him in the left leg, sending him stumbling against the wall. "Sarah Beth," he gasped, wiping blood from his eyes with the back of his hand. "I want you to know, these last few days, they've been the best of my life." She looked at him, this man who'd risked everything for a woman he barely knew, who'd given her back her dignity and self-respect when the world had tried to strip both away, and felt her heart swell with emotions she'd never expected to feel again. "Jacob Stone," she said firmly, reloading her rifle with hands that no longer trembled, "if you think I'm going to let you die protecting me, you don't know Sarah Beth Coleman nearly as well as you think you do." The final assault came with the fury of a mountain storm. Jameson's remaining mercenaries, desperate to end the siege that had cost them so dearly, threw everything they had at the battered cabin. But they found themselves facing not just Jacob Stone's military expertise and Sarah Beth Coleman's newfound courage. They found themselves facing something even more dangerous. They found themselves facing two people who'd discovered what they were truly fighting for, and who were prepared to pay any price to protect it. The silence that followed the final gunshot was deafening. Smoke from black powder and dynamite hung in the mountain air like fog, and the acrid smell of violence filled Sarah Beth's nostrils as she pressed herself against the cabin wall, Winchester still clutched in her trembling hands. Around them, the main room of Jacob's sanctuary lay in ruins, furniture overturned and splintered by rifle fire, windows shattered, the carefully crafted walls scarred by bullets and blade marks. But they were alive. Jacob Stone sat slumped against the stone fireplace, his shirt dark with blood from multiple wounds, his breathing labored but steady. His pale blue eyes swept the room, counting the bodies of Jameson's mercenaries who had made it through his outer defenses only to find death waiting in the mountain cabin. 7 men lay still among the wreckage, their weapons scattered, their threat finally ended. "Is it over?" Sarah Beth whispered, afraid to believe what her senses were telling her. Jacob listened intently to the sounds outside, or rather, the lack of sounds. No more coordinated rifle fire, no shouted commands, no movement through the trees that surrounded their position. The mountain had returned to its natural silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant cry of a hawk. "I think so," he said quietly. The ones still breathing seemed to have lost their taste for Jameson's money. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marcus Jameson's voice rang out across the mountainside one final time. But now the smooth confidence was gone, replaced by barely controlled rage and something that might have been fear. Stone. "Stone, you hear me? This isn't over. You may have won today, but I have influence in this territory. I have connections. I'll see you hanged for murder, both of you." Jacob struggled to his feet, using his rifle as a crutch. Despite his wounds, his voice carried clear and strong when he called back. "Marcus Jameson, if you're smart, you'll get on your horse and ride as far from these mountains as your money can take you. Because if I see your face in Colorado territory again, I won't be quite so restrained as I was today." The threat hung in the air like thunder. Then came the sound they'd both been hoping for. Horses moving away from the mountain at speed, the sounds growing fainter until they disappeared entirely into the vast wilderness that stretched toward the eastern plains. Sarah Beth set down her rifle with hands that shook from exhaustion rather than fear. The woman who had cowered in Marcus Jameson's carriage just days ago was gone, replaced by someone who had stood her ground against professional killers and emerged victorious. But victory, she was discovering, came with its own kind of pain. "We did it," she said, the words sounding strange in the sudden quiet. "We actually did it." Jacob nodded, but his attention was focused on more immediate concerns. "Help me check on the ones who are still breathing," he said, indicating the scattered bodies around the room. Some of these men might just be wounded. They moved carefully through the wreckage, Jacob's military training evident in the way he approached each fallen mercenary. Most were clearly dead, their wounds too severe for survival. But two were still clinging to life, a young man barely out of his teens with a bullet through his shoulder, and an older gunfighter who'd taken a rifle ball in the gut. "This one might make it, if we can stop the bleeding," Jacob said, kneeling beside the wounded youth. His voice held no anger, no hatred for men who'd come to kill him. That capacity for mercy, even toward his enemies, was something Sarah Beth was beginning to understand was fundamental to who Jacob Stone really was. They spent the next hour doing what they could for the wounded mercenaries, using supplies from Jacob's medical kit and clean water from his well. The young man, who gave his name as Billy Turner from Kansas, was coherent enough to talk. His story was depressingly familiar. Debts from failed cattle ranching. Desperation driving him to accept Jameson's offer of easy money. "I never killed nobody before today, ma'am," he whispered to Sarah Beth as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder wound. "My ma raised me better than this. I needed the money so bad." "We all make choices, Billy," Sarah Beth replied gently. "What matters now is what you choose to do next." The older gunfighter, a grizzled veteran named Dutch Morrison, was in worse shape but equally talkative once Jacob managed to get some laudanum into him for the pain. Morrison had been following the outlaw trail for 20 years, hiring his gun to whoever could pay his price. But something about the ferocity of the defense he'd just witnessed seemed to have shaken him. "Never seen anything like it," Morrison mumbled through drug-induced haze. "You two fighting back-to-back like that, never giving an inch. Like watching angels of death, beautiful and terrible at the same time." Jacob finished wrapping Morrison's wounds, though they both knew the man wouldn't survive another day without proper medical attention. "Dutch, if you make it off this mountain, what are you going to do?" Morrison's laugh turned into a cough that brought up blood. "Hellstone. After what I seen today, I might just find me a church and ask the preacher if there's any hope for an old sinner like me." While Jacob tended to the wounded, Sarah Beth began the grim task of searching the bodies of the dead mercenaries. It wasn't morbid curiosity that drove her, but practical necessity. They needed to know if any of these men had family who should be notified, and they needed to understand exactly who they'd been fighting. What she found disturbed her more than she'd expected. These weren't just desperate men driven to violence by poverty, like Billy Turner. Many carried personal effects that suggested education, refinement, even prosperity. There were photographs of families, letters from wives and children, jewelry that spoke of better times. These were men who'd chosen violence not from desperation, but from some darker impulse. Among the dead, she found a leather portfolio that made her blood run cold. It belonged to the man who'd led the final assault, and it contained detailed information about her full name, her marriage date, even a description of the blue dress she'd been wearing when Jameson's men first took her from Silver Ridge. But more disturbing were the other documents in the portfolio, names and descriptions of other women, some with notes like "delivered to Denver house" or "shipped to California buyer." Marcus Jameson's human trafficking operation was far larger than they'd realized, and Sarah Beth Coleman was just one of dozens of women who'd been bought, sold and transported like cargo. "Jacob," she called, her voice tight with anger. "You need to see this." He looked up from Morrison's bandages, saw the expression on her face, and immediately came to her side. When she showed him the portfolio's contents, his jaw clenched with fury that made his earlier violence seem gentle by comparison. "Son of a bitch," he breathed, flipping through page after page of documented human misery. "This isn't just about gambling debts or territorial influence. Jameson's been running a slavery operation right under the noses of the territorial authorities." Sarah Beth pointed to one particular document that had caught her attention. "Look at this. It's a letter from someone in Denver, placing orders like he's buying livestock. Send 2 more girls, preferably blonde, for the mining camp clients. The previous shipment was well received." The implications hit them both simultaneously. Sarah Beth's rescue wasn't just a personal victory. It was the discovery of a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple territories. And now Marcus Jameson knew they had evidence that could destroy him completely. "He won't stop coming for us," Jacob said grimly. "Even if he runs for now, he can't afford to leave us alive with this information. We're not just witnesses anymore. We're the only people who can expose his entire operation." The weight of that realization settled over them like a physical burden. Their victory in defending the cabin was just the beginning of a larger war against an enemy with resources and connections they could barely imagine. As if reading her thoughts, Jacob stood and moved to the window, scanning the approaches to his mountain sanctuary with new urgency. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "This place is compromised now. Jameson knows exactly where to find us, and next time he'll come with an army instead of just 15 men. Where can we go?" Sarah Beth asked. "If his operation is as big as these documents suggest, he probably has contacts in every major city between here and San Francisco." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his strategic mind working through their limited options. When he finally spoke, there was resolution in his voice that reminded her of the moment he'd first decided to intervene in her fate. "There's a U.S. Marshal named Samuel Crawford, stationed in Colorado Springs. Good man, fought with me during the war. If anyone can take on Jameson's organization and win, it's Crawford." He turned from the window to face her directly. "But Sarah Beth, you need to understand what we're talking about here. If we take this evidence to the authorities, if we testify against Jameson and his operation, we'll be marked for death by every criminal and corrupt official between here and Mexico. There'll be no going back to a quiet life after this." Sarah Beth looked down at the portfolio in her hands, at the documented evidence of dozens of women who'd suffered the fate Jameson had planned for her. She thought about all the Sarah Beth Colemans who might be saved if this evidence reached the right people. All the families who might be spared the kind of betrayal and heartbreak she'd endured. When she looked up, her grey eyes held the same determination that had carried her through the battle for the cabin. "Then we'd better make sure Marshal Crawford gets this evidence," she said firmly. And we better make sure Marcus Jameson pays for every life he's destroyed. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. You realize what you're saying? You're choosing to become a target for every criminal in the territory. You're choosing a life where you'll always be looking over your shoulder, always wondering if the next stranger you meet is another hired gun. Sarah Beth stood and moved to his side at the window, looking out at the mountain wilderness that had become both sanctuary and battlefield. Jacob Stone, a few days ago I was property to be bought and sold by the highest bidder. Today, I'm a free woman who helped defeat 15 professional killers. I think I can handle whatever Marcus Jameson and his friends want to throw at us. She paused, then added with a slight smile, Besides, I seem to have acquired a rather capable protector. Jacob's laugh was rich and genuine, the first truly happy sound Sarah Beth had heard from him since they'd met. Sarah Beth Coleman, you don't need a protector anymore. What you need is a partner. The word hung between them, heavy with implications and possibilities neither was quite ready to explore fully. But as they prepared to leave Jacob's mountain sanctuary forever, as they gathered the evidence that would make them fugitives and crusaders in equal measure, both understood that their story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. 3 weeks after the battle at Jacob's mountain cabin, Sarah Beth Coleman stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Colorado Springs, her hand steady on the leather-bound Bible as she swore to tell the truth about Marcus Jameson's human trafficking empire. The courtroom was packed with reporters, territorial officials, and curious citizens who'd come to hear testimony about what the Denver newspapers were already calling the Mountain War. U.S. Marshal Samuel Crawford, a distinguished man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the bearing of a career soldier, had listened to their story with growing outrage. The evidence they'd brought, Jameson's portfolio of victims, the detailed records of his criminal enterprise, the testimony of surviving mercenaries who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond a single gambling. Yet, Mrs. Coleman, the federal prosecutor began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Please tell the court how you came to be in Marcus Jameson's custody on the morning of October 15th, 1887. Sarah Beth looked across the courtroom to where Jacob sat in the gallery, his wounds from the mountain battle still visible but healing well. His pale blue eyes met hers, and she drew strength from the steady confidence she saw there. This was her moment to speak for all the women whose voices had been silenced by men like Jameson. My husband, Thomas Coleman, had accumulated gambling debts of $800 to Mr. Jameson, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. Rather than face the consequences of his addiction, he agreed to hand me over to Mr. Jameson as payment for that debt. I was to be transported to Denver and forced to work in one of Mr. Jameson's establishments until the debt was satisfied. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded grimly. And what happened when you attempted to resist this arrangement? I was told I had no choice in the matter, that I was property to be disposed of as my husband saw fit. Sarah Beth's voice hardened. Mr. Jameson made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, I would be taken to Denver by force, and that my treatment there would be considerably harsher. The testimony continued for 2 hours. Sarah Beth recounting every detail of her ordeal from Thomas's initial betrayal through the climactic battle at Jacob's cabin. When she described how Jacob Stone had intervened on her behalf, risking his life for a woman he'd never met, several women in the gallery wiped tears from their eyes. But it was when the prosecutor presented Jameson's portfolio as evidence that the courtroom truly erupted. Page after page of documented human trafficking, detailed records of women bought, sold, and transported across territorial lines, in correspondence with buyers in mining camps and frontier towns throughout the West. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked even the experienced federal officials. Your Honor, the prosecutor announced, The government has identified at least 47 women who were trafficked through Mr. Jameson's network over the past 3 years. Many of them are still missing. Others, he paused, consulting his notes. Others did not survive the experience. Marcus Jameson himself was notably absent from the proceedings. According to Marshal Crawford's investigation, he'd fled Colorado Territory immediately after the mountain battle, liquidating his assets and disappearing somewhere beyond the reach of territorial law. But his lieutenants hadn't been so fortunate. Pete Hawkins, Danny Reeves, and 3 other members of Jameson's organization sat in shackles at the defendant's table, their faces grim as they listened to evidence that would likely send them to federal prison for the rest of their lives. Thomas Coleman was also conspicuously absent, having vanished entirely after his cowardly appearance during the siege. Rumors placed him anywhere from Mexico to Canada, but Sarah Beth found she no longer cared. The man she'd married had died long before his body disappeared, killed not by bullets or violence, but by weakness and moral corruption that had eaten away at his soul like acid. When Sarah Beth finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt lighter than she had in years. The truth was finally out, officially recorded and documented. Whatever happened next, the world now knew what Marcus Jameson was and what he'd done to dozens of innocent women. Jacob was waiting for her in the courthouse corridor, his hat in his hands, and something approaching nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "You were magnificent in there," he said quietly. "Mary would have been proud of the way you spoke for all those women who couldn't speak for themselves." The mention of his late sister-in-law brought a gentle smile to Sarah Beth's face. Over the past 3 weeks, as they'd traveled to Colorado Springs and prepared for the trial, Jacob had shared more stories about Mary and Ruth, about his brother David, and the dreams they'd all had for building a life in the Colorado Territory. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it was no longer the driving force of his existence. "What happens now?" Sarah Beth asked as they walked through the bustling streets of Colorado Springs. The town was larger and more civilized than Silver Ridge, with electric streetlights, telephone wires, and the general air of progress that marked successful frontier communities. Jacob stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "That depends on what you want to happen, Sarah Beth. Marshal Crawford has offered me a position as a federal deputy, tracking down the remains of Jameson's network. It would mean travel, danger, time away from any hope of a settled life." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man accustomed to solitude. "But I've also been thinking about that school I wanted to start before the war. There are children in these frontier towns who need education, who deserve better than ignorance and violence. With the reward money the government's paying us for Jameson's evidence, I could probably afford to build a schoolhouse, buy books and supplies." Sarah Beth felt her heart skip a beat. "And you'd want me to help you with this school?" "I'd want you to be my partner in it," Jacob said, his pale blue eyes intense with conviction. "Not as my assistant, not as some kind of employee. As my equal partner in everything, the school, the mission, the life we'd build together." The proposal hung in the air between them, more significant than any marriage ceremony performed by a preacher. This was 2 people who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances, choosing to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. "Jacob Stone," Sarah Beth said, reaching up to touch his cheek with gentle fingers. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things," he replied, covering her hand with his own. "I'm asking you to help me turn a dream into reality, to build something that will outlast both of us." Before Sarah Beth could answer, they were interrupted by Marshal Crawford approaching from the direction of the courthouse. His expression was grim, and Sarah Beth felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "Mr. Stone, Mrs. Coleman," Crawford said, touching his hat brim. "I'm afraid I have news. We've received word from our contacts in Denver. Marcus Jameson was spotted 3 days ago boarding a train bound for San Francisco. He's not running anymore, he's regrouping." Jacob's jaw tightened. What does that mean for us? It means he's probably gathering resources and allies for another attempt to silence you both, Crawford replied bluntly. The testimony you gave today will be in newspapers from here to New York. Jameson can't afford to let it stand without response. Sarah Beth felt Jacob tense beside her, saw his hand move instinctively toward where his Colt would normally hang. But she also saw something else in his eyes, not fear, but determination. The same resolve that had driven him to intervene in her fate was now focused on a larger mission. "Marshal," Jacob said quietly, "I want to accept that deputy position you offered. If Jameson's building a new network, if he's planning to continue trafficking women, then someone needs to stop him permanently." Crawford nodded approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that, but it'll mean months of dangerous travel, tracking leads across multiple territories. It's not the kind of life most women would want to share." Before Jacob could respond, Sarah Beth stepped forward. Her chin lifted with the same defiance that had carried her through the mountain battle. "Marshal Crawford, I've already shared the most dangerous experience of my life with Jacob Stone. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." She turned to Jacob, her gray eyes shining with tears and determination in equal measure. "You asked me to be your partner in all things. Jacob, that includes the dangerous things, the uncertain things, the things that require courage we didn't know we possessed." Jacob's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks. "Sarah Beth Coleman, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, "but on one condition." "Name it." "When this is over, when we've helped bring down Jameson's network and made the frontier safer for other women, we build that school. And we fill it with children who learn that justice and courage matter more than money and power." The wedding took place 2 days later in the small church adjacent to the courthouse, with Marshal Crawford standing as Jacob's best man and the wife of the federal prosecutor serving as Sarah Beth's matron of honor. It was a simple ceremony, attended by a handful of officials and new friends they'd made during their time in Colorado Springs. But as Jacob and Sarah Beth Stone, she'd taken his name legally as well as personally, exchanged vows before God and witnesses. Both understood they were pledging themselves to something larger than marriage. They were committing to a shared mission that would define the rest of their lives. The honeymoon was necessarily brief. 3 days later, Deputy U.S. Marshal Jacob Stone and his wife Sarah Beth boarded a train bound for California, carrying federal warrants for Marcus Jameson and his known associates. The portfolio that had documented so much human misery was now their roadmap to justice, leading them toward a confrontation with an enemy who commanded resources they could barely imagine. But they were no longer the desperate fugitives who'd fled Jacob's mountain cabin 3 weeks earlier. They were partners in the truest sense, equals in a marriage forged by shared danger and tempered by mutual respect. Whatever Marcus Jameson had planned for them, whatever new challenges awaited in the lawless towns and territories of the West, they would face it as they had faced everything else since that first day on the mountain road, together. As the train carried them west toward an uncertain future, Sarah Beth rested her head against Jacob's shoulder and reflected on how completely her life had changed. A month ago, she'd been property to be bought and sold by gambling debts. Now she was a federal deputy's wife, a crusader for justice, a woman who'd found not just freedom but purpose. "Do you think we'll find him?" she asked quietly, watching the Colorado landscape roll past the train window. Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We'll find him, Sarah Beth, and when we do, we'll make sure he never hurts another woman again." She looked up at her husband, this man who'd kept his promise to win her freedom forever, and smiled. "Then I guess we'd better get to work." Deputy Stone, the train whistle echoed across the plains as it carried them toward their destiny. Two souls who'd found each other in darkness and chosen to spend their lives bringing light to places where it was needed most. Behind them lay the ashes of their separate tragedies. Ahead lay the promise of justice, the hope of redemption, and the endless possibility of love that had proven stronger than fear. The mountain man had indeed won her back forever. But more than that, they'd won each other, and in doing so, they'd found a purpose worth fighting for until the end of their days. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.